Hello sports fans, I'm Jordan and you're watching Jordan Sorcery, the home of Blood Bowl history. On tonight's show, we've got highlights from the first season of one of the greatest games in Warhammer history. There's locker room talk with the team behind Blood Bowl's creation. And our Nuffle correspondent is live at the Drac Bowl, ready to speak with the Auckland Raiders coach just as soon as the post-match riot wraps up. From American football's first appearance on British TV screens, thanks to Channel 4 in the early 80s, to the extremely complicated simulation of the game at tabletops thanks to a series of charts and tables-based board games, to the recent smash success of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, there were many inspirations that came together in the perfect scrimmage in order to create Blood Bowl, one of Jervis Johnson's earliest and greatest games. In this video, I explore the beginnings of this bloody beautiful board games, all the way up to the introduction of miniatures that would help to ensure this game would stand in a league of its own. How did a game set in a not quite Warhammer world, where orcs and goblins, elves and undead settle their differences not through fantasy battles, but through fantasy football, become one of the funnest, wackiest, and longest-lasting, most popular games in Games Workshop history? Don't touch that dial, because I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and we'll be right back with the making of Blood Bowl. As you know, Blood Bowl is an epic conflict between two sides each of 15 heavily armoured and quite insane warriors and their coaches. Players pass, throw or run with the ball, attempting to get it to the other end of the field, the end zone. Of course, the other team must try and stop them, and recover the ball for their side. If a team gets a ball over the line into their opponent's end zone, it's called a touchdown. If they score 3 touchdowns, they've won the game and are declared Blood Bowl champions. The first edition of Blood Bowl was released in 1986, and it was part of a series of what are commonly referred to as Games Workshop bookshelf boxed games. This was an early board game, rather than the miniatures game we would come to know and love. It's been revised, rewritten, rebooted in so many different ways, and its latest edition has returned it to the Warhammer Old World for a new season. But we want to look at how all of that came to pass. How did this murderous sports ball game that refuses to be relegated to history begin from such a simple set of card tokens and rules and become something incredibly special? This video is just one of many like it on the channel, where I explore the origins and the history of some of Games Workshop's greatest games. So if you enjoy it, please feel free to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out some of my other histories as well. So, where is best to start with the history of Blood Bowl? Perhaps it would be in the early 80s, and the introduction in the UK of a foreign sport and the unsuspecting British public that it would take by storm.
American football now from London, England.
When the UK's fourth terrestrial television channel first launched on November 2nd, 1982, it brought some exciting new programming to TV screens. Alongside quiz shows like Countdown and soap operas like Brookside, a key part of the lineup over its first decade was American football. NFL games, and later college football as well, were shown as part of the channel's commitment to diversifying the televisual landscape in the UK. In its first ever issue, published in 1988, Games International magazine even ran a feature on the surging popularity of the sport on TV and the tabletop. In the last 5 years or so, Basically due to Channel 4's innovative coverage, American football has become an extremely popular television sport, with viewers numbered in the millions. A major spin-off has been the appearance of hundreds of neophyte football teams across the country, all eager to wear that macho gear, hit hard, and throw tight spirals. Another spin-off, and one more relevant to this magazine, is that board game companies have finally caught on to the enthusiasm, and are marketing games that enable the armchair player to recreate football drama off the field. Although it was a part of Channel 4's schedule for 10 years or more, American football didn't become a permanent fixture in the UK sporting culture in the way that it initially had, but it did have an outsized impact on some viewers. There was one particular individual who found himself watching plenty of American football coverage on Channel 4, and even playing American football-based board games as well. That was Games Workshop employee Jervis Johnson, who worked in the trade sale department in London. He loved it so much, in fact, that it gave him the inspiration to create his own board game inspired by the sport. But first, he would have to convince his commissioner, Brian Ansell. In the early days, Games Workshop's success was built largely on the importing and distribution of foreign-made games, and then they moved into creating their own board games based on those designed elsewhere. In the early 80s, they moved that design process in-house and began publishing their own board games from start to finish. Early GW bookshelf board games were primarily based on licenses such as Doctor Who and Judge Dredd, and there would be plenty more like that to come. Through the 80s, the company secured some palpable hits with original titles like Talisman and later Chainsaw Warrior and Fury of Dracula, as well as by translating games from other countries and companies like Dungeon Quest. In 1983, Games Workshop had launched a new miniatures game in that same boxed format, Warhammer, a game that would slowly shift the company towards miniatures-led releases. But there was still plenty of life in the board game market for Games Workshop to explore through the rest of the decade. It was for this growing range of bookshelf board games that Jervis Johnson initially conceived of Blood Bowl, thinking that it would be something that could add to the range that sold incredibly well in the trade sales department. He was inspired by his love for American football, having watched plenty of it, but also having played a great deal of it at the tabletop as well. The idea of basing a board game on American football was not a new one. Even Board Game Geek struggles to keep the timeline of American football board games straight, but we do know that around 1950 there was a game called Football Strategy, but that was not the only one that would make use of that name. Around 1959, the strategy game company published Football Strategy, an intricate game of offensive and defensive choices that would be reprinted many times over the years, including by Sports Illustrated. Sports Illustrated magazine had also published their own game simulating college football since 1972, initially released as a Sports Illustrated game, College Football, and then re-released under the name Bowlbound the following year. The game made use of rigorous statistical analysis to try and faithfully replicate the real-life sport. After purchasing the rights to the entire Sports Illustrated tabletop stable in 1978, Avalon Hill released their own versions of some of these classic games. Pay Dirt was one such Avalon Hill title, based on the professional game, and it would receive updated team statistics all the way until 1995. Most of these games were designed to simulate American football, which meant that they included a great many charts and tables and statistics. That's something that may well be fun, but it doesn't always bring the most dynamism to the tabletop. A fact that Jervis Johnson would later learn when he actually started working on his Blood Bowl prototype. But they were not the only type of American football-based games. There was another that took a less mathematical approach, and one far more fantastical. Has it ever occurred to you how much big-time football resembles a fantasy adventure game? Players prepare themselves in a dungeon, the locker room, set out for the wilderness, the field at the appointed time, and then proceed to conduct melee after melee until a victor emerges. We've taken that line of reasoning one step further with Monsters of the Midway, this issue's special inclusion. You can choose and coach a team of 35 AD&D monsters, and the team that wins isn't always the one with the biggest players. That little guy with the hairy feet can really kick. Named in reference to the Chicago Bears NFL team, Monsters of the Midway was included in September 1982's Dragon magazine issue 65, published by TSR. The 8-page insert was designed by Gali Sanchez and Kim Mohan, and featured a hex-based gridiron to play on, monster drafting to build your teams, and rules for stuff like blocking, tackling, punting, and casting classic AD&D spells. Though still remembered fondly, it doesn't appear that the game was revived or revisited by TSR since it was published in that issue of Dragon magazine. There's no indication either that it was an inspiration for Blood Bowl directly, but it is fascinating to see the parallel thinking of taking tabletop monsters and putting together American football teams with them. By the mid-1980s, there was a healthy mix of board games based on American football, and if you were in the UK and wanted to watch some of the sport, all you had to do was turn on Channel 4. There was a buzz about it. The NFL was an exciting, fresh thing in the UK at the time. It, interestingly, wouldn't have that long a lasting impact. By the 90s, American football was not in the mainstream anymore, but Jervis Johnson had been quite taken with the sport, and the game that he would create would outlast its presence in the UK at the very least. So, how did he come to actually create Blood Bowl?
I was talking to Brian and I said, it would be cool if we had something in that we did do relatively large boxed games. Yes, so like Blood Royale and things like that, and Talisman and stuff. And I was saying it'd be useful if we had some little games, like 2 or 3 little games that were quick and easy to play. At that time, there were American companies like Steve Jackson Games doing micro games, they tended to call them, which were cheap, cheerful little things that you could buy for around about $5, I think, at the time. And so that's what I had in my head, and I just reeled off 2 or 3 ideas, one of which was, because I was obsessed with American football at the time. It was being shown on Channel 4, so I watched it quite a lot and really liked American football. And I said you could do something a bit like American football, but except it's like, it's orcs playing against, like goblins or something like that. And I went, ooh, I like the idea of that. You better go away and design it, Jervis. And I was like, I hadn't really thought that I was going to design it. I just assumed that you'd tell Hal or Rick to do it, basically. He said, no, you got to go and do it yourself.
Although Citadel head coach Brian Ansell couldn't really understand the appeal of the sport, apparently he didn't own a TV and hadn't followed any of the recent buzz about Channel 4's broadcasts. Its burgeoning popularity in the design studio was still enough to convince him to give Johnson's fantasy football concept the okay. With the commissioner on side, all Johnson needed to do now was actually create the game. His first prototype was a pretty direct simulation of American football, just like those Avalon Hill board games. One that was complicated, detailed, and took as many as 4 hours to play. He was going to have to think again if he wanted to make a game that was lighter and more dynamic. Fortunately, he could call on some teammates to help him out.
But then I got really lucky because I came up with that and I'd written the initial stuff down and I'd put some humour in. But then I got hooked up with Aly Morrison and Marc Gascoigne. Aly Morrison came up with the artwork and the look. And Marc Gascoigne did a huge amount of really important work in terms of developing up the background. He came up with the idea of Jim and Bob for the examples. And as a little team, we worked together. It worked together really well.
This first edition was released in 1986, and as Jervis had hoped, it was a bookshelf board game. It included everything that you would need to play your first games of Blood Bowl. There's a huge 6-piece cardboard jigsaw puzzle that fits together to represent the playing field. Over 100 card playing pieces, including many for the players themselves, who also get plastic stands, and a pad of team roster sheets, dice, and of course, the rulebook. Okay, I'm just going to be super facetious for a second here because I think this is funny. In the rulebook, there's a list of contents for the first edition of the game, which includes everything you would expect, the rulebook and the tokens and all that sort of stuff. But it also says, and I quote, that it is in the box, the actual game box. So somehow, Blood Bowl's box is both existing around the contents and inside the contents at the same time, which I think is quite funny. In the designer notes at the back of the rulebook, something that I am very grateful Jervis Johnson included in many of the games he designed, there is a little more info about the first steps in the creation of the game's rules. I now know that I had to keep the game fairly simple, and that I should forget about making an accurate simulation of American football. After all, I thought to myself, Blood Bowl is a fantasy game. At the time, I had just taken part in my very first Warhammer battle, and so had recently reread the rules. As an experiment, I tried out a simple game of Blood Bowl using the Warhammer rules, with only some very minor adjustments to cover throwing the football. Much to my surprise, it worked incredibly well, and I was away. Most importantly, Blood Bowl now felt like a fantasy game. Play was violent, fast, and varied. Or, to use design studio jargon, it had acquired Games Workshop's legendary chaos, death, spiky bits. As Jervis has suggested, the rules for the first edition of Blood Bowl didn't stray all that far from Citadel's recent, very, very popular release, Warhammer Fantasy Battles. But the actual nature of American football as a very start-stop kind of affair lends itself well to board game play. The rules, broadly derived from Warhammer, saw each player having a set of statistics, like combat skill, throwing skill, and cool, and players took it in turns to move and act with their entire team, in an I go, you go format. A player's players could move, hand off the ball between each other, tackle opposing players, or try and throw or kick the ball across the field to another player on their team. Tackles could get pretty brutal, and it was entirely acceptable, nay encouraged, to hit your opponents so hard that they were carried off the pitch. There's also rules for simple magic, tables for kicks and throws, and of course, for actually getting the ball into the opponent's end zone and scoring touchdowns, 3 of which would win you the game. The box includes a whole ton of player counters, enabling you to build teams of humans, dwarfs, elves, dark elves, halflings, hobgoblins, and orcs, not to mention ogres, trolls, mummies, skeletons, and more. There's also suggestions for making teams like the Chaos All-Stars, and the Champions of Death, and even the Heroes of Lore, though I wouldn't be surprised if the team called the Evil Gits was most people's favourite. Throughout the rulebook, and I think that this is one of the absolutely incredible things that the book does, there are loads of amazing illustrations of just gnarly and silly and funky and fun characters. The world of Blood Bowl is just created with this brilliant imagery. It really brings to life the humour and the silliness of this game and its world. All of the internal art in Blood Bowl's first edition was provided by Aly Morrison. Morrison is a long-serving Citadel sculptor who is still creating amazing miniatures for Games Workshop. He also helped to run Marauder miniatures with his then wife, Trish Carden, and has created countless incredible minis over the years. The counters and players, the field, and the wonderfully humorous art in the rulebook all came from Aly, and they bring such a huge amount of brevity and fun to the proceedings that catch the silliness of the fantasy football concept and run with it in exactly the right direction. Star players like Morganthrog, the Ballista, Jeremiah Cool, the Flashing Blade, and Warhammer favourite Harry the Hammer Kerry, or Harry Kerry, all add to the vibe. A particularly fun page of art shows some of the standard referee signals to look out for in a match. Just fantastic nonsense that reminds one of the comic books of the era. The box cover itself was actually illustrated by a professional comic book artist, Brett Ewins, who worked on Judge Dredd and 2000 AD, and had worked for Games Workshop on the Judge Dredd RPG and Chainsaw Warrior games. Not only that, but he illustrated the infamously incomplete Caleb Dark comic in the Citadel Journal, and was slated to provide art for the Warhammer Comics projects that went unpublished in the late 80s and early 90s. Along with the comedic interiors, this cover really helps to set the light, sometimes zany but still brutal comic book tone that would come to define Blood Bowl, and which is still very much present to this day. The art is not the only thing in the rulebook that brings this game to glorious life, though. There is so much more. The commentators Jim and Bob, the amazing Did You Know sports factoids that are just silly and brilliant and just so funny. And then there is the lore as well. The history of the game as a gift from the god of violent sports, Nuffle. Like the art, the story of Blood Bowl is appropriately madcap and silly, a clear effort to embrace the funnest aspects of tabletop gaming and give players an excuse to have wild fun whilst playing. In summary, there was a god of violent sports. nuffle, and some exhausted, warring dwarfs and orcs stumbled upon an ancient temple or stadium in the middle of an Amorican battlefield. Rather than keep duking it out with their knackered armies, they agreed to listen to a wise dwarf seer who translated an ancient text about a great ritual featuring 11 players per side and an inflated pig bladder ball between them. The game doesn't really take place in the Warhammer world, just taking lots of inspiration from it, but later articles and editions hewed much closer to that idea. Instead, this edition is really a parodic fantasy world, borrowing even more liberally than Warhammer would from classic genre fiction like Lord of the Rings and parodies like the Harvard Lampoon's Board of the Rings. This world is just Monty Python-esque sublime silliness. It accommodates all of the wacky, wonderful nonsense that you could want in a game about ogres smashing skeletons into the dirt and just ignoring the football altogether in the ancient land of Amorica. It's just silly brilliance. It's so good. The first draft of the game's history and the legend of Nuffle was written by Stuart Parkinson, a member of the Citadel design team who also wrote the amazing time capsule that is 1986's Heroes for Wargames, a book that provides some muddy instruction on role-playing and wargames, but is also one of the most amazing sets of photographs and early artwork from behind the scenes at Citadel in the mid-80s. Parkinson was perfect for the job of drafting up Blood Bowl lore because he was one of those NFL fans that Games International had talked about in their article. He actually played the game in the UK's growing Sunday League scene. As if one needed any more hints that the game is based on American football, the Blood Bowl rulebook is full of funny and wonderfully on-the-nose references. The game takes place in the New World, more specifically Amorica. The first commissioner of the Nuffle Amorical Football League is a dwarf seer called Rose L, taking after the NFL commissioner of 30 years, Pete Rozelle, the very name Nuffle, of course, being a riffle on the acronym NFL. And then there's the long-standing and much-loved commentators of Blood Bowl, Jim Johnson and Bob Bifford. The latter is a reference to NFL announcer Frank Gifford, who actually hosted some of the earliest games shown on Channel 4, whilst Jim Johnson is a deeply veiled nod to the game's designer, Jervis Johnson. A fact that would become only more obvious in later editions when the commentators went from looking like two identical but pretty regular guys in the street to a vampire and an ogre. Even with the idea of brutal sports violence at its heart, it really can't be understated just how much fun the rulebook really is. Editor Marc Gascoigne has been credited with much of the humour and the style of the thing, and for creating concepts like those sports commentators Jim and Bob, the pitch-black humour of the little sports trivia facts that line the pages, and the general vibe of a light, breezy sports almanac that encapsulates the entire thing. Mention must also be made of the graphic design by Chaz Elliott, who also gave 40k Road Trader its unique structure and layout. Blood Bowl is yet another design triumph that looks absolutely the way it should and feels brilliant for it. As much as Blood Bowl became something that is just instantly recognisable and this long-standing brilliant sort of world and game and a rule set that was consistent and robust for a long time, this edition isn't so much about the rules. These rules will change significantly. It is the rule book and the way it is presented that does so much to establish Blood Bowl as just a franchise, as something that is worth continuing, that is worth exploring more, and that is just worth lots of additions and just amazing things to come. But before all of that, they would need to get people playing it. And that is always a challenge for a new game. The first roar of the Blood Bowl crowd came in White Dwarf issue 84 from December 1986. It was here that we would get to hear for the first time the Blood Bowl fight song. Give us more of the stuff we like to see. Give us a B and an L and an OOD. If you don't like it, you're a brainless troll. What do we want? We want Blood Bowl! In the following issue from January 1987, White Dwarf would review this brand new board game. At that time, White Dwarf was still a broadly independent magazine covering the tabletop industry, and particularly RPGs, with a relatively even hand. Richard Meadows reviewed Blood Bowl's first edition for issue 85, and he started by both praising the concept of a fantasy American football game and acknowledging that Monsters of the Midway had been a thing years ago, but no one at TSR could get themselves together enough to actually publish it as a full game. After praising the high-quality components and the magnificent fun of the well-written and humorous rulebook, Meadows concluded his review with some very positive words. The combination of this presentation and the chaos, death, mayhem that occurs on the pitch make this game very, very entertaining, and a must for all fans of American football, good old-fashioned death and violence, or just having a good time. White Dwarf may have been Games Workshop's broad-shouldered quarterback, and we'll pass back to it in a moment. But there was also another publication, a sort of quirky, unusual gimmick or gadget or trick play called Black Sun. Black Sun was something of an incentive for mail-order subscribers of White Dwarf, and it included lots of zany and unusual art, concepts, and ideas. There were silly gameplay enhancements like battle chairs for inclusion with the game Battle Cars. In an interview with the Realm of Chaos 80s blog in 2013, Tim Pollard mentioned a fun bit of Black Sun meets Blood Bowl trivia. GW was splendidly indulgent of my silliness, sense of humour, writing style, and Mickey taking. Oh, and it had the first ever Andy Chambers rule in it, which was his kickoff rule for Blood Bowl. Black Sun is such a fantastically unique bit of Games Workshop history made all the more wonderful by the generous and brilliant Tim Pollard. Not only did Tim make a huge contribution to Games Workshop history, but he was also Nottingham's official Robin Hood for many, many years. Tim tragically passed away earlier this year, but he and his amazing work on Black Sun and beyond it are very fondly remembered. Although there was not an extensive run of new articles about Blood Bowl in White Dwarf during this first edition era, there was still some incredible support in the magazine, starting with a brand new team. February 1987 brought with it White Dwarf issue 86, and in its pages, Jervis Johnson shared a brand new team for Blood Bowl, the Skaven Scramblers. There were full rules for fielding a team of the raucous ratmen from Clan Rygens and their most infamous team. There were some appropriately ratty star players, like Glart Smashrip, who still hasn't retired from the game, and Shish Forearms, whose mutation is 4 arms. As the first White Dwarf article about the game, it also took the opportunity to include some errata for issues to do with handoffs, the kicking table, and prone players catching the ball. A couple of issues later, in White Dwarf 88, there would be a truly astonishing crossover: Blood Bowl meets Judge Dredd. Following a somewhat tortured explanation of a magic spell that brings Mega City 1 denizens to the new world of Blood Bowl at the hands of a necromancer called Ter Eo Gan, who one might think is a reference to Terry Wogan, the article introduces 2 new teams from the pages of 2000 AD for you to play the bloody brutal football game with. One made of judges and one made of fatties. As if Judge Dredd's patrol mates were not absurd enough, there would be another addition to the Blood Bowl game through White Dwarf that was even more ridiculous and over the top and bloody. They would introduce chainsaws. White Dwarf 94 provided rules for not just classic pit and snake traps in the game, but also for players who wanted to rev up a chainsaw and really start cutting down on the opposition. Against all odds, the chainsaw has become something of a long-running thing in Blood Bowl, and whilst it seems likely that the contemporary excitement around fellow GW board game Chainsaw Warrior might have made the idea feel more reasonable, it was actually a Golden Demon entry that gave Jervis the idea to write the rules in the first place. From the few memories I have of the Golden Demon Day, one in particular still stands out: a diorama called Pass Interference. The diorama depicted, as I remember, 2 skeletal Blood Bowl players defending a third, who was about to throw the ball. Nothing odd in that, you may think, and I would have had to agree, if the skeletons hadn't been armed with a chainsaw each. I don't know who made the diorama, and I don't know how well it did in the awards, but it served as the inspiration for the chainsaw-y part of this article. I've not actually been able to track down any images of this diorama, or whether or not it did succeed at Golden Demon. But if you know anything about it, please let me know in the comments. That same issue of White Dwarf would also announce the release of a brand new supplement for the game called Death Zone.
But it just proved really popular. It sold very well. And then so Brian said, okay, we've got to rush out an expansion for it. So we did the first expansion, Death Zone, which I think came out like really quickly after. It shows how different things were then. Because we could sort of like say, okay, let's go, let's make an expansion for this game and get it out sort of like in a few months, basically. Now it would take a few years.
Even if he wasn't a fan of American football, Brian Ansell was very much a fan of smart business decisions. And in something of a frantic tush-push, Johnson was instructed to create a brand new supplement for Blood Bowl in record time. It was only around 9 months after the release of the game that the supplement hit shelves. When we started receiving letters about Blood Bowl, one thing soon became obvious. Everybody liked the game and wanted more. Lots more. Not just the teams and rules that we couldn't fit into Blood Bowl, but rules for all kinds of other things as well. Death Zone was the result. A job made much easier thanks to the contributors whose work is included in these pages. In every case, they came up with rules and teams that were better than the ones I'd designed, or for the matter, rules for things I hadn't even thought of doing myself. Thanks, guys. Contributors to the supplement included Mike Brunton, David Knott, Mark Labbott, Tom Scutt, Mark Walsh, and the aforementioned Tim Pollard. The set was again edited by Marc Gascoigne. In the box were a whole host of new and revised rules, an entire magic system, more robust campaign rules, and plenty of new teams like Werewolves, Albion Wanderers, the Slan, and Nurgle's Rotters. There were also some new star players, including White Dwarf's favourite snail-brained barbarian, Thrud, and a manic halfling called Arfie Schwarzenegger. Like the base game, Death Zone is full of amazing art, this time from the likes of Dave Andrews and Colin Dixon, the latter of whom created the art for the supplement's box. It was also with Death Zone that artist Pete Nifton began contributing to Blood Bowl. His work would go on to define the enduring feel of the game, as he created many of the incredible illustrations that made the second edition of Blood Bowl so very memorable. Whilst I was working on this video, news broke of the very sad passing of Pete Nifton, a giant of not just 80s Games Workshop art, but also fighting fantasy books and music releases like the album Warmaster by Bolt Thrower. His work had an incalculable impact on so many gamers, and will surely live on in our hearts as well as on our tabletops. Blood Bowl had originally been conceived by Jervis Johnson as a board game designed to fill a specific gap in the Games Workshop offering. But it and its expansion, Death Zone, had sold faster than a ball that was drop-kicked by a troll. It was incredibly popular. So if this game was going to continue, and it looked like it was, then it would need to be part of the future of Games Workshop and Citadel. And Citadel was pushing Games Workshop away from the creation of board games and role-playing games and towards miniature games. So Blood Bowl would need some of its own. There would have to be a range of specific Blood Bowl miniatures. The first ever in-house Blood Bowl miniature was scratch-built and painted by longtime Games Workshop employee Dave Andrews, as a proof of concept for the very idea of Blood Bowl minis. It was a wonderfully relaxed orc linesman drinking a brilliant can of Coke. Andrews still works for Games Workshop, and in his long and storied career, he's held a great many roles, including having created art for Death Zone. And of course, you can see him leading a mighty Bretonnian war host in the pages of the 3rd edition Warhammer supplement, Warhammer Armies. The Orc player absolutely proved the point, and a proper range of miniatures was commissioned to go with the game. Sculptor Aly Morrison, who had made the art for inclusion in the 1st edition's rulebook, was too busy to do art for Death Zone because he was now sculpting the initial set of miniatures to go with the game. It started with the famous Blood Bowl ogre from Brett Ewan's cover, Morgenthau, and would include a number of generic players for a range of different teams. There wasn't an expansive collection of Blood Bowl miniatures for this 1st edition, but they did exactly what they were supposed to, proving that people wanted to see their Blood Bowl players in not cardboard, but marvellous metal. With the addition of a model range, Blood Bowl became something that Games Workshop and Citadel were already getting very good at making, a miniatures game. That meant that there were new collectible aspects to the game. You could build your own team, you could collect and paint and evolve your team as you wanted over time. There would be a push to make this phenomenally successful game into a pure miniatures game, and that would come with the release of a 2nd edition just a year later in 1988. But that is a match for another time.
And now looking back from where I am now, I know that games design is not a singular process. There can be a name on a box, but actually it's much more like being involved in making a movie or something like that. It's a team of people with different skills. And what makes it work well is luck and that combination of different things, and everybody then sparking off of each other and kind of like raising it up. So one person will have an idea and then somebody else will run with that ball a bit, appropriately enough for Blood Bowl, I suppose. But between the three of us, we created this thing, which was rather cool.
Designer Jervis Johnson, editor Marc Gascoigne, artist Aly Morrison, and a team of other creatives created something very cool indeed. A game that has stood the test of time, that is still going to this day, and that has made for countless brutal, funny, brilliant matches of the most fantastic fantasy football ever played. But sports fans, that is where we must end it for this video. I think that there is potential to come back and look at some of those evolutions, some of those later seasons, to see how Jervis and his team created something even more memorable, even more exciting, even more fun with edition after edition. Before I go, I want to know from you, what are your favourite teams and star players from Blood Bowl history? Leave a comment down below and let me know whether it's from this edition or a later edition, because I think there are so many fun names that I just love hearing them. And if you like this video and would like to subscribe to my channel, to like this video and share it more widely, I would really appreciate it. And of course, you can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/JordanSorcery, where I share research, I share exclusive and early access content, interviews, and lots of other stuff. And it all helps to ensure that I'm continuing to do this work and can put more time into more Blood Bowl videos, as well as the history of so many other Games Workshop games. That's it for tonight. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Thank you very much for watching, sports fans. This presentation has been made in association with Bloodwiser. Stay classy, Amorica.